Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. And while there is certainly one God rhetoric in the Bible, this is not the concept of monotheism as we understand it and use it today. And in this video, I want to talk about just one of multiple different reasons that we know monotheism as we understand it today is not in the Bible. And I want to talk about the relationship of monotheism to the doctrine of creation out of nothing. The word monotheism was coined in around 1660 by a Cambridge Platonist named Henry Moore. And then it was used by deists in the 18th century. It began to pop up in dictionaries. It was used by Christians and anthropologists and others in the 19th and the 20th centuries. But it always presupposed the notion that God was the creator of all that existed out of nothing. In fact, the originators of the term and the first people to popularize the term said that Greek philosophers, while they came close to monotheism, didn't really get all the way there because they always maintained a belief in the eternal nature of matter. And this compromised God's sovereignty. This made it so there was something beyond God, outside of God, other than God, that always existed as long as God existed. And even today, both critics and apologists agree that monotheism needs creation ex nihilo. So, for instance, Paul Copan and William Lane Craig published a book on creation ex nihilo a while ago, and as we see on this page, they talk about belief in creation ex nihilo and say, monotheism demands it. Now, why does monotheism demand it? Elsewhere, they say the following. Thus, the idea held by ancient Greek and contemporary Mormon thinkers alike that there can be independent, eternally pre-existent matter coexisting with God, a metaphysical dualism, affirms a form of idolatry, compromising both the ontological distinction between creator and creature and the nature of divine sovereignty. We have another discussion on the part of a more critical scholar, Philip Alexander, who's a phenomenal scholar of early Judaism, who says monotheism, as it has been understood from the medieval schoolmen onwards, is predicated on the premise that God is the ultimate cause of all things, and that implies creatio ex nihilo. But where is the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo in Scripture? Not in Genesis 1. At least since the time of Rashi, it has been well understood that the complex syntax of the opening sentence of that passage implies that chaotic primordial matter pre-existed God's act of creation there described. And creation then has to mean the imposing of order on chaos, rather than the bringing into being of all things out of nothing. This understanding is in keeping with the apparent etymological sense of the verb bara, which seems to mean cut or hew, and thus presupposes the preexistence of matter that is shaped. Thus, what we have here is prima facie a doctrine of the preexistence of matter, which some later theologians, Maimonides for example, would reject as incompatible with strict monotheism. So, you don't have monotheism until you have creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. But you don't have creation out of nothing until around 170 CE, the end of the 2nd century CE, well after the very last book of the Bible had been composed and its author was gone. So, again, creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, is a post-biblical philosophical innovation. And if your concept of monotheism relies on creation ex nihilo, which the concept of monotheism always has ever since the concept was coined in the 17th century, then your monotheism is a post-biblical philosophical innovation as well. I discuss this in a lot more detail in this essay, Monotheism, from the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion, which was just published last month. Unfortunately, this is still behind a paywall, so you will need access to the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion if you want to read it. But there's a ton of other wonderful stuff on creation ex nihilo that you can check out. For instance, Gerhard May's book, Creatio ex nihilo, The Doctrine of Creation out of Nothing in Early Christian Thought. This is a translation from the original German book. There's also a wonderful doctoral dissertation by James Hubler, Creatio ex nihilo, Matter, Creation, and the Body in Classical and Christian Philosophy through Aquinas. There's also a ton of great information in the back and forth between Jonathan Goldstein and David Winston in the Journal of Jewish Studies from back in the 80s. And you can check out Gary Anderson and Marcus Bachmuel's more recent volume on creation ex nihilo, where they defend it theologically, but are kind of forced to acknowledge that the doctrine itself was not actually articulated till the late 2nd century CE. And then there's also a Scottish Journal of Theology article by Marcus Bachmuel on creatio ex nihilo, where again he kind of reluctantly has to admit that while the constituent elements of the doctrine were in circulation prior to the 2nd century CE, they were not put together to construct and articulate the doctrine itself until the late 2nd century CE. So again, we don't have creation ex nihilo until the late 2nd century CE. The way that monotheism has always been understood, it requires the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, and therefore monotheism, as it has been understood from 1660 down to today, is a post-biblical philosophical innovation. Now, if you want to revise how you understand the concept of monotheism so that you can still find it in the Bible, you're free to do so, but just be aware that that's what you're doing. You're renegotiating the concept of monotheism just so you can find it in the Bible, which is a dogma that one just chooses to accept. It's not supported by the data. And the fit for this video